Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, Prof. Panel and all the participants. We also have Mr. Arif Lesmana here, which will help us technically during the summer course program in ASL. It was great to meet you all online at this morning lecture that will be delivered by Prof. David Panel. Hello, Prof. Panel, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Okay, I also hope you are having a good time. And all at this lovely day, Prof. Panel will share a great lecturing about the economic value of diving tourism. I believe that this topic is fascinating. So class, you need to pay attention to Prof. Panel materials and please make a compelling discussion session right after the materials delivered. And Prof. Panel, time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. It's nice to meet you all and to have a chance to speak to you about this subject, which I think fits very well in the theme of the summer course. So I hope you enjoy the presentation. I'm going to start by sharing my screen.
You can share it now, Prof.
Okay,
Okay.
yes. How's that? Can you see?
Yes, already seen in the monitor, Prof.
Okay, can you see the PowerPoint slides?
Yes,
Okay, are they full screen?
yes, of
Is it,
course, Prof.
okay, that's great. All right, so my presentation will be on the economic value of shark diving tourism. So it's about tourism, it's about economics, it's also about nature conservation. So I see that in some of the other topics that you will cover in this course, people talk about synergies. So synergies means that the things move together so that conservation and economics or tourism can both improve, or sometimes there could be a trade-off. Sometimes in order to conserve something natural, to look after nature, there may be an economic cost instead of a benefit. This is an example where there are synergies, where conservation and economic or tourism benefits move together, so they can both be positive. All right. Now, the starting point for my seminar is recognizing that there is a problem around the world in shark conservation. In many parts of the world, sharks are being harvested, are being killed at a very high rate. There are millions of sharks being killed every year, and this is too much. There are too many sharks being harvested for the shark population to maintain, to stay the same. And so in many places, the number of sharks is falling, and this is having big consequences. Here's an example of a shark being caught. That's only one shark. Often we see that there are many sharks being captured. Sometimes they're being captured for food to eat the whole shark. So this is a photo from Africa. And you can see they've caught a large number of sharks there, which they're going to eat. But more commonly, the biggest problem is actually sharks being captured for fins, for their fins. So here's a photo of a very large number of shark fins that's used for shark fin soup, particularly in Asia, primarily in China, but in other parts of Asia as well. And this is causing a big reduction in the number of sharks that there are in the world. And that has other problems because it means that the ecosystems that the sharks live in are being affected, and some of the animals that they would otherwise eat are growing in population, and so the whole balance of the ecosystem is being changed for the sake of shark fins. It's particularly sad because in reality, shark fins are made from a substance called cartilage, mainly of cartilage, and the cartilage has no flavor. So shark fins don't really need to be in the soup to generate the pleasure of eating that soup. So it's a big problem, and it's one that we hope we could manage in various ways. There is an alternative to harvesting sharks that also can generate an economic benefit, and that is tourism. Around the world, there has been a big increase in the number of tourists who wish to dive or snorkel around sharks. And here's a photo which illustrates some tourists who are diving, and there's a large shark just swimming near them. And this is becoming more and more popular. And of course, these tourists pay money for the service that they get to be allowed to be taken to an area where sharks will swim and they can safely snorkel or dive with the sharks. And so can be employed, and it's another way that income can be generated for people in these areas where these shark diving tours are offered. So there's one example. Here's another example. You can see that the sharks sometimes are very big, and so the divers, it's a very exciting and thrilling experience, although perhaps also quite scary to be diving with these very large sharks. There are different types of shark diving. In that example I just showed, the diver is present with the shark and could actually touch the shark, whereas this is an example where the diver is in a cage. The reason that the diver is in a cage is because this is a very dangerous shark. This is a white shark. You can see from its teeth that it could really hurt the diver, and most of the shark deaths that are caused around the world are caused by this type of shark, a white shark. And so divers who go with these sharks will always be in a cage. This is also a shark with big teeth, although it's not a white shark. I think it's probably a tiger shark who can also be quite dangerous. But you can see that this diver is getting very close to the shark. It's feeding the shark. Sometimes there are many sharks. So here's an example where we can see about 10 sharks swimming around near the divers. So that's another example. Uh, Very large numbers of sharks. These are smaller ones. I think these are reef sharks, so there's not so many, and they're not so big, but there's a very large number of sharks. And this is a different type of shark diving. This is diving with whale sharks. Whale sharks are the largest shark. You can see how big that shark is. It's really enormous, but they are not dangerous. They don't consume other animals. They just filter feed. They eat krill like a whale, and so they're not going to hurt the diver by biting them, but nevertheless, it's still very exciting for a diver to get close to a large whale shark. So you can see that there are many types of sharks where there is tourism, and they occur in many different places. Um, this is some information that's a little bit old now. From a few years ago, we estimated that there were over 400 different shark tourism operations, so different businesses, companies that you could pay to take you to dive with sharks. And you can see from the map that these businesses are in many parts of the world. They're all around the world. They're not just in one place. And there's around 100 different places, 100 locations where shark diving tourism is done. And each year, there's around 500,000 tourists who pay to dive with sharks across 45 countries. So it's becoming quite a large and important tourism sector. There are many different types of sharks and rays, not just sharks, but also rays, stingrays, and manta rays, and so on, that uh, these different shark diving tour operators will take people to. I've showed you some already, but you can see from this slide that there are about 50 different types of sharks and rays that are the basis for tourism. And that you can see also that there are many different types. They look very different. They're different sizes, different colors, different shapes. So it's very interesting. If you're interested in sharks, you can see many different types of sharks as a tourist in different parts of the world. There have been quite a large number of research studies that have tried to quantify the benefits of shark dive tourism in different places. I'm going to show you three examples shortly that I've been involved in, but this list just shows you that there are many different studies of different types of sharks. So we can see here we've got various studies looking at whale sharks, some looking at reef sharks, whaler sharks, white sharks, tiger sharks, lemon sharks, various sharks and rays. So lots of different types of sharks. And this column shows the amount of income, the amount of money that they generate each year. So this is the amount of money that tourists spend to tourist operators to see these sharks. And you can see that they're in different places as well, many different places. Excuse me. Okay. And again, this is a little bit old. I'm sure the number has grown since this number, but a few years ago, it was estimated that around $314 million US per year was spent on whale tourism. And this is increasing around the world rapidly and is expected to double over the next 20 years. So it's already large and it's getting bigger. Okay, so I'm going to just pause there for a moment. And as I go through my presentation, I'm going to ask you some questions. And I'd like you to answer these questions in the chat in Zoom. So I've got three questions that I'd like to get your answers to. The first question is, have you ever been diving or snorkeling? The second question is, would you like to go shark diving or not? And why or why not would you like to go shark diving? So I'm very interested to know your answers to those three questions. Have you been diving or snorkeling? Would you like to dive with sharks? And why or why not? I'll wait for a couple of minutes while you type in your answers um, in Zoom. Let me stop sharing so I can see the chat. So if you type yes, oh, okay, that's question one is no, no. Okay, have you never been? Okay, that's interesting. Question one is have you ever been snorkeling or diving? Somebody has. Someone's been, Devani's been snorkeling. Nuva would love to. Kotaha has been, and Sarah doesn't want to. Okay, Abdul says no, has not been snorkeling or diving. Yes, would like to. And three, I have a fear of water, so that's why I will, so I can come up with this fear. Okay, so that you can try to beat that fear. That's interesting. And Wazif has not gone diving with sharks because Wazif is afraid of sharks, and I think that is completely fair enough. I think I would be afraid of sharks too. When I look at the teeth of some of those sharks, and I know that sharks do kill people around the world, then I too would be quite scared. So Mohammed Hakil says no, but would like to get that thrilling experience. I think that is the real reason why many people like to dive with sharks. it's very exciting because it feels a bit dangerous. It feels like you're doing something where you could get injured, and but you trust the dive operator to say, no, these sharks will be safe for you, but it's still thrilling. It's still exciting because it is a bit scary. Okay, Ignatius would like to. Okay, Azari can't swim yet. Okay, Kezia has been scuba diving. And has been diving with sharks. That's very interesting. And so Kezia does like diving and has been diving with sharks. Well, I admire you, Kezia, to have the courage to go diving with sharks. Okay, let's look at a couple more here. Okay. Thank you everyone for answering that question. That's interesting. So we have some people who have never been diving and some people who have been diving or snorkeling and have done it with sharks. So that's impressive. All right, I'll go back to sharing. Okay. Right, let me continue on. So I'm going to show you three different case studies where we looked at the economics of shark diving, and we looked at it in some different ways and in different places, and that was different types of sharks and different types of tourists as well. So we'll look at some of the interesting things we learned about shark dive tourism in different parts of the world. The first example is in Palau, which is quite close to Indonesia. The second example is in Australia, which is also quite close to Indonesia. And the third example is in the Maldives. So that's islands in the Indian Ocean, quite close to India. All right. So Palau is a very small country that is just northeast of Indonesia. If we look at this map up here, the globe, you can see where Indonesia is, and there is Palau right there. So it's sort of east of the Philippines, northeast of Indonesia. And you can see this is if when you look at it closer, this is what the country looks like. It's a very large number of islands. There's about 340 islands, um, a total of only 466 square kilometers. So it's a very small place overall, with a population of only about 20,000 people. The whole country is only 20,000 people. And its GDP, so the total flow of income and earnings in that country, is only about 300 million US dollars. And it turns out that a large share of that income is from tourists, but we'll look at that in a little while. In this map over on the right, you can see a number of spots with numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is where shark diving takes place, and where my collaborators in this research have been going for years and studying the ecology and the behavior of these sharks, as well as studying the tourism that they have generated. Now, Palau is a very interesting country because it established the very first shark sanctuary. A sanctuary is a place where you can be safe, so you can be protected. No one will hurt you. That is what a sanctuary is. And a shark sanctuary is a place where sharks can be safe. So that means that as a country, Palau said that all the fishermen had to stop catching sharks. So this was back in 2009. They made this decision. You can see over on the right, I've got part of an article that appeared in the New York Times. So the New York Times is probably the most famous newspaper in the world, and it thought that this was a very interesting topic, an interesting subject, because Palau was the first country to ban shark fishing and create a shark sanctuary. Even though Palau is a very small country, I said back here, it only has 466 square kilometers of land. The shark sanctuary is large. It's 600,000 square kilometers because it covers the whole exclusive economic zone for the country. And the ocean that belongs to Palau is much larger than the land that belongs to Palau. So it's actually quite a large um, sanctuary zone. And the reason, well, one of the reasons that they wanted to do this was to try to generate more tourism. And it did. It was very successful in generating more tourism. And an environmental group called Pew um, asked me and some collaborators to look at the tourism that had resulted from the creation of the shark sanctuary. So that's what we did in this study. So that you can see on the right, this is part of Palau. This is what Palau looks like. It actually looks a little bit similar to some areas in Indonesia. So some areas in the eastern part of Indonesia, um, around Papua, that I've seen photos of, look very similar to this. Um, so if you've been to West Papua, you would have perhaps seen islands that look a bit like this, where the ocean sort of cuts in under the rock. So one of the things we learned is that about 80,000 tourists visit Palau every year. So that's big for Palau. Remember, there's only 20,000 people who live in Palau permanently. So there are 4 tourists for every person in the country. So you can see that that means it's a very important industry for Palau. Not all of those tourists go there because of the sharks, but some of them do. A significant number do. They go because they like to dive with sharks. And there are 2 main species of sharks that are present in the diving areas in Palau. There's the white tip shark and the grey reef shark. And very quickly, a large number of shark dive tour operators set up their businesses to operate in Palau. So within 1 year of the sanctuary being created, there were already 18 licensed shark dive tour operators. So they got it going very quickly. To try and understand and measure what had happened in Palau, we did a number of surveys. You can see from this table the surveys that we did. So we did 2 surveys with tourists, a survey with the dive operators, a survey of the dive guides themselves, a survey of fishers, and a survey of the operator of the fish market to try and understand whether sharks were still being captured for sale and the other types of fish that they were being caught. So the 2 surveys with tourists were both face to face. So we actually interviewed them at the boats where they were about to leave or had just come back from dives. You can see how many we surveyed, about 250 tourists, 10 dive operators, 20 dive guides. So these were local people employed by the dive operators to guide the tourists, 21 fishers, and the person who managed and operated the fish market. All right, so they were predominantly face-to-face interviews. Okay, so here are some of the results that came from those different surveys. When we put it all together, this is some of what we learned. I've already said that there were about 80,000 tourists that go to Palau every year. We learned from our surveys that the number of those tourists who went diving was about half. So 41,000, just a bit more than half of the 80,000 tourists go to Palau in order to dive or do some diving as part of their tourism. So that shows you how important the diving is as part of the tourism industry there. And of those 41,000, 8,600 were tourists who went to Palau particularly to dive with sharks. That's why they went there. If there was no shark diving, they would not have gone to Palau. Because of the shark sanctuary, they decided to go to Palau and to dive with sharks. So that is the spending of those tourists, those 8,600 tourists, is what we want to measure because those are the tourists who are there because of the shark dive industry. So those are the ones that we were most interested in. All right. So we have many results from this study. I won't talk about all of them, but let's just look at a few results in this table. You can see that um, the the business revenue generated by all of the divers, not just the shark divers, but all divers, was about 83 million US dollars. Of course, it was, they don't do the money in US dollars, they have a local currency, but we converted it to US dollars. And of that, shark divers spend about 17 or 18 million dollars. So that's the income that's generated due to shark diving. But there is also tourism that doesn't involve any diving. So the non-divers generate $57 million. The total tourism income is $140 million. And the shark divers themselves spend $3.5 million on shark diving itself. So that's the amount that they spend, that's the amount that they pay to the tour dive operators. But of course, they spend more money than that. They spend money on food and restaurants and hotels and on other tours and on other materials that they buy, perhaps things that they want to keep to remember their holiday. So they spend a lot more money than this $3.5 million. In fact, they spend $18 million overall. Okay, so that gives you a sense of how large it is. The really interesting thing is that $18 million is about 8% of the entire GDP of Palau. So it's a significant part of the whole economy of Palau, and it creates quite a bit of employment of local Palau people. So it's a very successful example of a conservation policy which has also generated a lot of income. One of the things that we were able to do from the information that we had was to calculate the value of a shark. Now, this is because of the studies that my colleagues and collaborators had already done, looking and tagging and monitoring the sharks that were present in the different dive sites. They actually knew how many sharks were there and were regularly present in the dive sites and were swimming close to the tourists. So these were really the sharks that were the important ones because these are the sharks that the tourists could see. And, this was the exciting experience, was seeing these sharks. And it turned out that there's only about 100 of these sharks. So not very many. And on average, if you look at the total revenue that is generated, these 100 sharks are generating about $179,000 of revenue each per year. That's every year. So given the lifetime of a shark is a couple of decades, then the lifetime value of these sharks is about $1.9 million. So each shark is worth, on average, about $1.9 million. That's a very valuable animal. That's a lot more valuable than any agricultural animal. And we'll see in a minute how that compares with the value of that shark if we were to catch it and eat it or sell it to be eaten. So, what is the value of these sharks if they were caught by fishers? If we assumed that all 100 of those sharks were caught, that would be difficult, but let's suppose we could catch them all, and we sold them for the market price of fins and meat, then the total price of all 100 sharks would be about $10,800. That's compared with $1.9 million per shark for one shark. So the value for tourism of these sharks is about 1,700 times larger than the value to fishers. So it's a very, this policy of having a shark sanctuary has meant that Palau generates a lot more income than it used to do when it used to catch fish, catch the sharks, and sell them. Now, this research has been written up and published. On the left-hand side there, you can see the journal publication in a journal called Biological Conservation. So if you are interested and you want to read more about this research, you could go and read that up. I will provide a copy of these slides so that you can see the title and the authors of that article. You can see that I'm one of the authors there, the third author. On the right-hand side, you can see another article in the New York Times, the same newspaper again that I mentioned before. This time, the newspaper article is about our research study. So the paper on the left generated an article in the New York Times, which is talking about the value of sharks and that saying that they are much more valuable for tourism than they were to be caught and sold for food or fins. So that was very exciting for us as researchers. It's not very common for researchers to have an article published in the New York Times. So we were very happy about that. And also we were happy because it raised awareness in other countries as well that shark tourism could be very beneficial and could be much more beneficial than shark fishing. All right, so what was the response in Palau? Well, of course, you can imagine, you would expect that the people in Palau are very happy that their president and their government decided to create a shark sanctuary because it means that there's a lot more income for people in the country now than there used to be. So they're very happy. And the president of Palau, President Thomas Remagesor, who you can see a picture of there, Thomas Remagesor Jr., he talked about our study when he addressed the United Nations in New York in 2014. And he was explaining to the different countries of the world how successful their shark sanctuary had been. And he told them about our research and the results that we had found as part of his persuasion, is part of his story as to why this was such a good idea. The Palau government thought it was so successful that they would further extend their sanctuary. So in 2015, they established a marine sanctuary banning all commercial fishing, not just sharks, but every type of fish in 80% of its exclusive economic zone. So now it's still possible to catch fish in Palau, but you have to go to the right area, and it's a relatively small part of their zone. So that's been a really big change in Palau. And of course, they're trying to generate even more tourists. They want the tourists to know that if they go to Palau and go diving, they will see lots and lots of amazing fish, not just sharks, but all sorts of fish. So they have learned from the experience of the shark sanctuary and trying to apply it more generally. Okay, I now want to ask you some more questions, and then I'll pause for a little while and ask and allow you to ask me some questions. So I've got three questions for you. Question one, how do you think the ban would affect fishers in Palau? And second question, would the fishers be better off or worse off in the short term? And third question, would the fishers be better off or worse off in the long term? How would it affect fishers in the short term? And how would it affect them in the long term? What do you think? Put your answers in the chat for me. Nuva says yes, it would affect the fishers. Yeah, Mohammed Hakil says the income will fall. Yeah. I would like to see more answers in the chat. What do other people think? So let me explain the short term and the long term. I'm asking two questions there. How would it affect them quickly, straight away? And then how would it affect them if we waited a few years and came back? Would they would they be better or worse off straight away? And then would they be better or worse off if we came back? Let's say we come back in 3 years or 5 years and talk to people who used to be fishers. Would they be better off or worse off? What do you think? Uh-huh. Thanks, Wasif. Yes. Okay. That's Dewey's giving me a full answer there. So number one, they will lose their job for a while. So that means they'd be worse off in the short term. But Dewey's suggesting they could be better off in the long term because they can get other jobs. They can shift their job from being a shark fisher to be a shark dive guide, but not necessarily a shark dive guide. What other things could they do apart from being a shark dive guide? Remember the shark, I showed you the income where the shark dive income or the spending by tourists was only $3.5 million, but their total spending was $18 million. So they're spending money on other things as well, not just on the diving itself. Yep, shortly it will be very much worse, Abdul Sabur says, but in the long term it'll be good as the shark population will increase and may government change its policy. Ah, that's interesting. Ignatius says open a restaurant. Yes. Uh, Kotahar says fishermen will lose their jobs unless they got job related with tourism. Yep, that's right. And I think what we can see, at least for this example, is that there were many jobs created in tourism, not just in diving, but also in restaurants and in tourist guides on the land, um, in serving in shops because there are more tourists there. So there's people selling things to tourists, not just food, in hotels as well. So the the fishermen and their families could get many different types of jobs. So I think for most fishers in the long run, they would be better off. In the short run, though, it could be quite tricky, right? Quite difficult. I can imagine that when the Palauan government decided to ban shark fishing, that the fishers who were catching sharks were very unhappy. I think they probably thought that they would be worse off, and they probably didn't realize that this was a good decision that would generate a lot more income, and that they could probably make more income from other jobs than they were making from shark tourism. And it would take a while, maybe a year, before they realize that this is really the case. So from a government point of view, it could be a decision that is a little bit difficult at first, but then later on, people see the benefits. Okay, thank you for your answers there. That they're very good answers. Let me stop talking for a little while and see if there are some questions. I've got a couple more examples to show you, but I thought I would let you ask some questions first, if you have any questions. Hello, Ari. Would you like to, or is it Asari? Sorry.
Yes,
Would you like to
sorry.
ask a question? You can speak if you like to, or you can put it in the chat, either way.
Asari, I think her internet
No,
going
that's
down.
okay. That's
Yeah.
okay. If
Maybe the others, yeah.
if you'd like to put it in the chat, that would be fine. Anyone? I'll just wait a minute because if someone does have a question, it might take a little while to type it in.
Mahmoud Basir, do you have any question? Or Rifdah, maybe?
Okay, I've got one.
Yeah.
Abdul Sabur has asked a question. He said, you mentioned about the worth or value. Can you please explain a little bit more regarding the average revenue and the lifetime value? Okay, good question. I'll go back to sharing so you can see my screen as I talk. All right. Okay, so this first value, the 179,000, that's easy to understand because if you look back here, right, the shark divers spend $18 million per year. That's per year, right? Every year they spend about 18 million, and there are 100 sharks. So 18 million divided by 100 is about 180,000, right? So that's all that is. That's just the average per shark. If there are 100 sharks that we're saying are the ones that generate all of that $18 million. The lifetime value, I know that some of you have studied economics, but not everyone. If you've studied economics, you might be familiar with the concept of discounting. Discounting is a way of converting uh, benefits or costs in future years, so that you can express them in their present value. So if we have, let's say we've got $179,000 that occurs in 10 years' time, let's say that's going to occur in 2034, what's the value of $179,000 in 2034 if we express it now in 2024 dollars? So we need to allow for inflation, but we also need to allow for the fact that if we get the income sooner, we can invest it and earn money that way. So $179,000 received in 10 years' time is not worth as much as $179,000 earned today for that reason. So this 1.9 million is just saying we have For a shark, it's generating $179,000 in 2024 and $179,000 in 2025 and 2026 and 2027 and 2028 for the life of a shark, which might be about 20 years. And we convert all of those values back to 2024 values and add them up. And that gives us the 1.9 million. So you can see it's less than 20 times 180,000 or 179,000 because it's not just adding them up, it's allowing for the difference in the value of money at different times. Okay, I hope that helps you understand that. Okay, we've got some more questions now. Uh, Mohammed Bashir says, uh, do the sharks travel long distances due to disturbances? That's a very good question. Some sharks do travel long distances even without disturbance. So I mentioned those white sharks. I showed a picture of somebody in a cage, and in their natural behavior, those sharks are known to travel a long way. They tend not to hang around in one place. They tend not to stay in one place. They swim, you know, tens of kilometers each day looking for food, and they have been tagged and monitored over very large distances. So that's interesting. But in the places where those white sharks um, have been trained to, to come to see the tourists, then they do tend to hang around. So they are fed. They know that there will be food at that place where the tourists come. And so they're more likely to stay there. Um, on the reef sharks, so some of the sharks that I'll talk about, are one of the ones I already talked about was a reef shark. They would tend to hang around in a relatively small area, um, and not travel so much, unless there is damage to the reef. So, for example, in some parts of Asia, people use dynamite to blow up the reefs to kill fish, to catch the fish. In that case, of course, the sharks wouldn't stay there because the reef has lost all of its population of fish. Okay, there's a couple more questions coming in now. Here's one from DZ. Palau is very interesting because the number of tourists is very large compared to the population. That's right. Are there any considerations in terms of carrying capacity? That's a very good question. You could easily imagine that in a small country like Palau, that you might end up with too many tourists. And then it becomes a matter for the government to manage. I guess they have to put constraints on how many people can visit at any point in time. Not all of those 80,000 people are there at the same time. You know, they come for short periods, maybe a week or two, and then they go away again. So, you know, the number who are there would be much less than that at one time. But still, you can imagine that it could well get quite crowded at some times. Um, I've been to Bali, and at times in Bali, in certain parts of Bali, it gets very crowded. And so, um, but of course, you know, going to Bali, you've got options to go to other places. You can travel to Lombok or to other parts of the island of Bali or to Java. So there's many other places you can go. Whereas in Palau, it's a much more limited area, much smaller area overall. Okay, what's the next one? Sarah, how can shark-related wildlife tourism contribute to promoting environmental awareness and preserving endangered species? Well, that's a great question. And that is, in fact, one of the reasons that conservationists are very interested in this type of tourism, because they realize that if people can see that wildlife generates income through tourism, then they will want to conserve the wildlife. And you can see that because the sharks are worth much more for tourism than they are for fishing, it creates a very strong incentive, a very strong wish to maintain, to conserve the sharks. So I think there are lessons here, not just for sharks, but for other types of wildlife as well, if they are the type of wildlife that tourists would like to come and see. We know that in Africa, for example, the large African animals, the giraffes and the lions and zebras and wildebeests and so on, the large animals that live on the African savanna, a lot of tourists go to visit those as well. And there are large national parks which are like these shark sanctuaries, where the hunting is not allowed and the animals are kept safe and protected from hunters as much as possible. They do have a problem with hunters trying to kill the animals anyway, but they do try to prevent that as much as they can. Okay, let's look at the next one. Ignatius. I'd like to ask you a question on movies like Jaws and Meg. In these movies, sharks are portrayed in a negative way, making people afraid of sharks. Do you think these movies would affect shark tourism in a negative way? And should we stop making movies about sharks that portray them negatively? It's an interesting point. I think you're quite right. I think that they would affect many people who've seen those movies would feel very scared of sharks and would be worried about going to shark tourism. The the thing that might help shark tourism is other tourists, because when people have a very good experience of swimming with sharks and come away and tell their friends or tell other divers that they enjoyed themselves and that it wasn't dangerous, then that could change people's opinion, I think. But you're right that in the end, there will be some people who get so scared from the movies that they will never want to go and swim with a shark. And there's probably nothing much we can do about that. Um, should we stop making movies about sharks? Well, we probably don't have control of that. I don't think that we can actually decide to stop. It's other people are making that decision. So um, I'll leave that one at that. Let's see if we've got some more questions. Ah, interesting question by Fatima. What is the economic impact of shark sanctuaries on neighboring regions that still allow shark fishing? Um, it's a good question. I have not studied that. I don't know the answer. I imagine it depends on how close they are. If and on how connected they are, both from a fishing point of view and a tourism point of view. So let's imagine that there are two countries quite close together, and in one area they allow shark fishing and in the other they don't. Then part of one thing that would happen is that some sharks would swim from the protected area to the unprotected area and be caught by fishers. Okay, so there would actually be a benefit to the country that does not have a shark sanctuary, because their fishers could still catch more fish, more sharks as a result of the other country's sanctuary. So there's some benefit there. There's also potentially a benefit in tourism. If I've traveled from Australia to one country, maybe I can just make a short trip to go shark fishing. Maybe I can just make a short trip to the other country, because it's always interesting to go to a new country and visit there as well. So the country that does not have a shark sanctuary could benefit from tourism as well, I would imagine. So it seems as if that's not very fair, right? The country that has created the shark sanctuary and gone to all the trouble and the care to do that is not capturing all the benefits. Some benefits are being captured by another country that has not had a shark sanctuary. On the other hand, the fact that those countries are close together, maybe the other country could see how successful the shark sanctuary is at generating extra tourists, and they could copy the first country and also create a shark sanctuary. So in the long run, maybe it would equal out. But in the short run, and yes, perhaps it could be a bit unfair. Okay, yes. So Nuva mentions the whale shark tourism in Saleh Bay. That's right. So Indonesia does have a shark tourism industry based around whale sharks. It's quite a successful one. So okay, let me read the question. Yes. Do you have any idea about how to escalate people? Can I just check with you, Nuva, what you mean? Do you mean to attract more tourists?
No, because you have already made a research about the economic value of that tourism, but using the value, how we can show that value to the people, including the tourists, of course, to increase their awareness about the importance of shark conservation, bro.
Okay. Maybe let's leave that one because I've got another example later on, which I'll talk about um, the actions taken by tour dive operators to conserve sharks, and I'll mention how they also educate the tourists when we get to that. So I will leave the questions there for now so that I can continue with my examples, but we'll come back and have some more questions later on.
Okay, bro.
Okay, let's keep going. I'll share screen again. All right. All right. Okay. My second example is Australia, another country that's close to Indonesia. And I'm going to look at four different shark dive industries in Australia. You can see that they are spread all around the country. In the northwest, we've got a whale shark um, industry, and we've got white sharks, grey nurse sharks, and reef sharks in different parts of the country. Let me just show you what those different sharks look like. I've already shown you a whale shark, and there's another one. This is in Ningaloo region in Western Australia. It could well be some of the same whale sharks that also swim up to Indonesia, to Salo Bay. They're probably some of the same sharks that move between the two places. Th This is the white shark swimming in South Australia on the southern side of Australia. Again, you can see because these are very dangerous sharks, the tourist is in a cage. This is reef sharks, so these occur on reefs, and this is in the Great Barrier Reef area of Queensland. So the Great Barrier Reef is the largest coral reef in the world, and it has a very successful reef shark industry. You can see they're smaller and they're not so dangerous. They don't tend to bite people. And there is a grey nurse shark in the eastern side of New South Wales. They're quite big, as you can see, and they look a bit scary, but clearly they're not as dangerous as the white sharks because they allow tourists to swim with them without a cage. Okay. So again, we did questionnaires with the tourists, and we're trying to get information about all four of those sites with the same or a very similar questionnaire. And we asked them about the amount of money they spent on the diving, the amount they spent on accommodation, on transport, because some of these shark dive areas are a long way from the main cities. Their living costs, like restaurants and hotels, um, and other costs like souvenirs. We also asked them about their motivations for diving. So, why did they want to dive with sharks? And was it something that they did often, or was it a one-off thing? You can see some of the results here. So each column here, we've got whale sharks, white sharks, grey nurse sharks, and reef sharks. And you can see the number of survey responses we got. Each of them we had more than 100. For a couple of them, we had more than 200. Um, and the results were a bit different between the different areas. So the total number of divers we found was about 22,000 for whale sharks, 10,000 for white sharks, 14,000 for grey nurse, and only 2,000 for reef sharks, much smaller than the others. We can see a bit of a mix. In some cases, it's about even male and female. So that one's even, the reef sharks is even. But for white sharks and grey nurse sharks, which are perhaps the more scary sharks, we've got more males than females, which is interesting, about two-thirds male, one-third female. Um, we've also got differences in age. So for the whale sharks and the white sharks, the largest group is the relatively young group, 21 to 30. But for the others, it's a bit older. So for the grey nurse sharks, the biggest group is 30 to 40. And for the reef sharks, it's pretty even. We've got anyone between 20 and 50, or really 20 and over to up to 60, say, pretty even spread of ages. So I don't know why that is. We weren't able to understand why the age differences why there were such big differences in the ages. This shows the amount of money that each diver spent on shark diving, including accommodation and meals and so on, transport. And you can see it's quite different. In some cases, so for whale sharks, it was between $500 and $2,000. For white sharks, it was, what's that, about 800 to nearly $2,000. The grey nurse sharks, much less, maybe just a few $100s. And for reef sharks, it was much higher. Looks like about 4,500. So reef sharks is they're located in a relatively remote area and much more costly to get to. Okay. So this is a sort of a summary. I've already mentioned the numbers of divers for the 4 different types of sharks in the 4 different parts of the country. This is the total amount of spending. And so 11 million, 8 million, 4 million, 2 million. And the total expenditure is about $25 million. Now, clearly for Australia, this is a much smaller part of our economy. This is quite a small industry compared to within the overall Australian economy, compared with the situation in Palau, where diving and tourism are much bigger parts of their economy. So 25 million is significant. It's important. It creates a number of jobs, but it's relatively small compared to the situation on small island states where tourism is much more important. Okay, so that work on shark dive tourism in Australia is also published in a paper in this journal. I've got one question. I want to keep you thinking about these issues. The question which I'd like you to put in the chat is, why do you think there were so few divers for reef sharks? I'll just remind you, there's only 462 divers for reef sharks. Whoops. But there's at least 10,000 or more for the others. Why was there only less than 500, less than, half of 1,000 reef sharks, do you think? Do you have any ideas why that might be? Pop them in the chat. There's more than one possible reason why that could be the case. I'm interested in your ideas. Okay, so Zainab has said, because it's expensive compared to the others. That's certainly true. It's the most expensive option. So that's one reason. Have you got any ideas about others? Yes, that could be true. Nuva says they may not have much information about reef sharks. Perhaps the other shark diving industries have better promotion, better marketing. I think that the whale shark industry has the best marketing, and it gets the most tourists. So that's a reason. Any more? Maybe they don't have sources. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe you could explain that a bit more because there aren't many reefs left. That's a good idea, but actually it's not correct. There are lots of reefs still left. There have been severe damage to some of the Great Barrier Reef, probably about half of it. But the area where these sharks are is in the relatively northern area, and the condition of the reef there is still pretty good. I like Mohammed Bashir's idea, maybe because it's not dangerous, right? Maybe the people who want to dive with sharks like to dive with dangerous sharks like white sharks or the ones that look dangerous like grey nurse sharks, or very, very big sharks like whale sharks. And if that's the case, then the reef sharks are a bit boring, right? They're not that big and they're not dangerous. So maybe they're not so exciting. Maybe that's part of it as well. Not as popular. Uh, I guess reef sharks are hard to handle and dangerous. No, actually, that's not true. Um, they are they are the least dangerous of the sharks. Oh, well, they're about as dangerous as the whale sharks, but they're much smaller. And those two are much less dangerous than the white sharks. Yes, I like that one, DZ. Traveling is more expensive. And Aisha says, yes, adrenaline junkies would love to go for the more dangerous and the bigger sharks. Yes. Okay, thank you. That's good. I think that's all of the main ideas we're going to get. Okay, let's keep going then. All right. Now, I just want to give you a little bit of economics. As I said, some of you have got training in economics, not everyone, but some of you have. And so I'm going to just sort of put this in the context of a simple supply and demand model for shark tourism and just talk about what it is that I've actually measured so far in the examples that I've shown you. So if you've studied economics, you will definitely recognize this graph. So this is a supply curve for shark tourism services and a demand curve for shark tourism services in a particular place. And if those are the true demand and supply curve, we know that the quantity demanded would be here and the price in the market would be here. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is ask the question, well, what have I measured so far in the examples that I've shown you, and what would it look like on this graph? So what I've measured is the total amount of revenue generated by tourists who pay the shark dive tourist operators. So specifically, I've been looking at how many tourists there are and how much money they spend. So what that is that area, okay? That area, this distance across the bottom is the number of tourists who pay money to shark dive tourist operators. And this distance is the amount of money they pay to shark dive tourist operators per tourist. And so if I multiply the number of tourists by the amount of money that they pay, I'll get the total amount of money that all of the tourists pay, but I'll also get the area of a rectangle, right? And so that area would tell me the total amount of money paid by tourists to the shark dive tourist operators. So that's what I've done so far. However, if you study economics, one of the things that you learn is how to measure the benefits to consumers and producers from a market good. So tourism is a market good, and if you've studied economics, I hope that you are already thinking about what the next graph will be. The next graph will show the benefits to tourists and that's it. The benefits to tourists is called consumer surplus, and it is the area above the price line, below the demand line, up to the quantity that's actually purchased. And so this area is the net benefits to consumers from going and consuming shark dive tourism services. It looks smaller than the total amount of revenue, but that's because that revenue is something that the tourists pay out. It's not a measure of how much benefit they get. In fact, you can see on the graph, there's no overlap between the amount of money they pay out and what their benefit actually is. Okay, so it's important to understand that there are other ways of measuring the benefits to consumers, and the consumer surplus is an important one. There's also a benefit to producers, which is that triangle. It's the area above the supply curve underneath the price line up to the quantity sold. Okay, so that is basically an approximation of the profit that the shark dive tourism operators would generate. And so if if that is the total revenue that is paid to the shark dive tourism operators, and that is the profit that they end up getting, you should be able to guess or work out what that other area is below there. That's their costs. Okay. Running a shark dive tourism business means you have to pay for boats, you have to pay for fuel, you have to pay for staff, you have to pay for a building. So all of those costs have to get subtracted from the total revenue that is paid by tourists. And so the tourism operators are left with a benefit that is smaller than the total amount of revenue because they have some costs. Okay, so I don't want to dig too deeply into that. I just thought that for those of you who've studied economics, it would be interesting to see how what we've talked about fits within an economic model. And in the next example I will show you, I'll give you an example that's like this, where we look at consumer surplus. So the next example is in the Maldives, as I mentioned earlier. The Maldives is in the Indian Ocean, close to India. There's India. Um, if there's anybody from India on the call, you could put that a little note, say hello in the chat. Here's a map of the Maldives. It's a little bit like Palau. It's a bigger country than Palau, but it has a large number of islands and it relies on tourism a lot for its income. It's another small island state. It has 1,200 islands. About 200 of those islands are inhabited, and 122 are resort islands where the tourists tend to go. And tourism, again, is a large share of its GDP, about a quarter of all of the revenue generated, all of the transactions that occur in the Maldives are from tourism. Of course, again, that's not all for sharks, but diving and snorkeling are the most popular form of tourism. And diving with sharks and rays is again an important component. Back in 1991, an early study estimated that there was about $2.3 million from diving and $0.5 million from fishing, but that has changed a lot. Diving is much larger now. And if we just look at whale sharks alone, and they don't just have whale sharks, but whale sharks alone generates about 9 million. Um, so it's but there are other types of sharks as well. You can see a different sort of shark over here in this picture on the right. I'm not sure what type of shark that is, but you can see it's very different from the ones that we've looked at so far. However, the Maldives in the mid 2010s, they noticed that their number of sharks in their tourism areas was declining from fishing. And so they looked at what had happened in Palau and decided to copy it and to create a shark sanctuary as well. And so they did that in 2010. So pretty soon, actually, it was almost immediately after Palau, they created a sanctuary. And since 2010, their shark numbers have recovered to some extent, but there's still some problems. They still have some challenges which I'll talk about. So what has been reported in the Maldives is that the scuba divers, the divers who go there, have still complained that they sometimes see illegal shark fishing. So there's still fishing going on, not as much, but still some. And if you go to the shops in the Maldives, like here's a window of a shop over here, you can see that shark jaws and teeth are still for sale. Some of them may be imported, but it's suspected that some are from sharks that are caught locally. Some fishers are known to kill sharks in order to protect their catch because they think the sharks are competing with them. You know, that the sharks eat the fish instead of the fishers catching the fish. So so all of this involves people killing the sharks, and that's a problem because killing the sharks has what economists call an external cost. So an external cost means a cost to somebody else. So the fishers might kill the sharks either to reduce competition or to sell their jaws or their meat, but there's an additional cost that they don't consider, which is the cost to the tourism sector. Sometimes in the Maldives, we know that the dive operators do take some action. And this goes back to Nuva's earlier question that from talking to the dive operators, we know that they like to educate their local tourists about the importance of shark conservation in order to keep the sharks there for tourism. And from talking to the shark dive operators, we know that there are different things that they sometimes do to try to protect their tourism by protecting the sharks. They report the fishers to authorities if they're seen catching fish. The resorts sometimes refuse to buy fish from fishers who catch sharks. They may patrol the dive sites and look for for fishers who are catching sharks. But they also might try to help the fishermen to earn money in other ways that doesn't involve catching sharks. Or they may support fishermen socially, or through an education campaign, or through providing infrastructure like roads or buildings that would help them to do things to generate an income that doesn't involve catching sharks. Or they could integrate the fishermen into the management of the shark sanctuary and pay them to help. So there's many things that can be done. Um, and we know that the shark dive tourist operators are doing many of those things. Okay, so we did a similar sort of survey. I'm looking at the time. I don't want to run out of time for some more questions at the end. So I'm going to quickly just jump to the key results here. We found that the average age was about 42. For most of them, about 3/4 of the tourists, diving was the main purpose of the trip, about 40% female. 34% knew about the shark sanctuary. 13% had observed illegal fishing or illegal selling of shark products. Um, there was reasonably high satisfaction with the shark diving experience, and the divers spent about $4,000 each to travel to the Maldives and do their shark diving. Um, one of the interesting things we did with these tourists was we asked them what would happen in different situations. So we've got the status quo, so the current situation. If fishing was present, just look at this bar in the middle. This is the median amongst the people who responded. So if fishing was present, the median response was that they would make no more trips to the Maldives to see sharks. And if sharks were absent, they would make very few trips. If conservation was absent, they would make very few trips. If conservation was present, they would make more trips, and so on. So we could see that shark conservation and shark fishing made a big difference to the plans of these tourists in terms of whether they would come back to the Maldives in the future. And over here we can see the proportion of respondents who would plan to come back in the
Claire.
next. Hmm, okay. The dark line shows the proportion who plan to come back in the next 5 years. And again, you can see that if there is conservation of sharks, more of them plan to come back. And the light bar, the very tall bar here, says they would recommend Maldives to other people to go for tourism. And look at these really tall ones. They are for where, um, oh, sorry, this is where they would not recommend it, right? So if fishing was present, they would not recommend the Maldives to their friends to go for tourism. Or if sharks were absent, they would not, almost everyone would not recommend the Maldives. Or if conservation was not being practiced, most of them, three quarters, would not recommend the Maldives. So again, more evidence that shark conservation was very important for the tourism income. And this shows the numbers, right? If fishing was present, there would be a 56% reduction in tourism, in shark tourism, and an increase in income for the local tourism industry. Sorry, there would be the tourism income would fall from 154 million down to 68 million. So a very large fall. And on the other hand, if they were able to increase the number of sharks that were present, they could increase the number of tourists by 15%, and they could increase revenue from 154 million up to 179 million. So clearly, the conservation of sharks is highly beneficial. All right, I've nearly finished. So you can see more information about this study if you want to in this journal called Tourism Management. So that we managed to publish that one there just a few years ago in 2018. All right, and as I mentioned before, there are many studies now that look at the economics of shark dive tourism. Here are a few examples, including one in Indonesia, right? So there's in this national park off Papua, there is a whale shark industry. Okay, I'm going to leave that because we've got little time left. I'm just going to finish with this idea, which is the idea of existence value. So far, we've looked mostly at market values. So market values is where the tourists are paying for their accommodation, for their tours, for their food. They're actually paying for a service or a good in markets. But there are also non-market values where there's no money changing hands. So that could be recreation, where people are just doing recreation without having to pay for it because it's local and they can easily do it themselves. Or it could be a non-use value. This is called an existence value. So what is an existence value? An existence value is the benefit that people receive from knowing that a particular environmental resource exists, such as an endangered species. And the relevant people don't need to necessarily even see the species. They just need to know that it still exists for them to feel something positive, that they are getting some benefit from the fact that it still exists. Now, because it's not a use value, it's a non-use value, the value of conservation might be relatively small per person, per animal, But you can often get large numbers of people who have an existence value for some types of animals. And so the total existence value could be very large. So this is important because um, we are concerned about sharks throughout the world, not just in tourist areas. We would like to be able to conserve sharks in other areas as well, not just where there are tourists. And this information says that there's probably a benefit from doing that, even if there's no tourism, there's still a benefit from shark conservation because the sharks have an existence value. And that existence value includes the ecosystem in which the sharks live because the sharks influence the state of the ecosystem. All right. So on the right, you can see another paper that my team produced. This one was a meta-analysis of the value of wildlife, of the existence value of threatened species. Around the world, we looked at 109 different examples from 19 countries and found that the average existence value was $414 per household per species. And it depends, the actual existence value depends on what type of animal it is, and it depends on how threatened the animals are. But even away from dive areas, it means that conservation of sharks could be quite valuable, and catching a shark has an external cost. All right, so this is the supply and demand for a caught shark again, but this time where um, uh, this time I'm going to impose on that an external cost of catching sharks. So this is okay. I should stop for a minute. The earlier supply and demand graph that I showed you was for tourism. This time I'm showing you the supply and the demand for sharks, for caught sharks. So this is like the supply and the demand for a shark fishery. And it looks a bit the same, that the supply and the demand curves are in different places. But again, we've got an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity here and here. But if we allowed for the external cost of catching sharks, this existence value, even where there's no tourism, I mean, where there's tourism, the external cost is really obvious. But even where there's no tourism, there's still that existence value. The real cost is higher, right? So this is the total cost, and it's higher than the supply curve. So from the point of view of society as a whole, this is the total marginal cost. And so that's like the supply cost for society as a whole. And so the optimal position to operate is here at a much lower level of catch of sharks compared to right up here if we ignore this external cost of the existence value of catching sharks, of maintaining sharks. So if we could account for this existence value, we would probably have very different policies about catching sharks. And it's even possible that if the existence value is high enough, you end up with the marginal cost being so high that the optimal level of shark catch is zero, which is what we saw in Palau, and it's probably also the case in the Maldives. The optimal level of sharks to catch in those countries is zero. In the world as a whole, it might not be zero because the values might not be quite that high, but it's surely a lot lower than it is happening at the moment. All right. So to finish up, here's my final slide. Tourism with sharks and rays is growing. Conserving sharks and rays has a commercial value. In the shark dive sites, the market value of sharks for tourism is much larger than the market value for fishing. So in those places, banning shark fishing has community support, and it's possible to get that policy change in place. governments are willing to do it because they know there'll be large benefits to the community. On the other hand, sharks and rays also have an existence value. And so away from dive sites, banning shark fishing mainly would benefit people who live far away from those sites where the ban is happening. And so it might be difficult to get a policy change through because the people who would be affected, the people who would bear the costs, are probably not the main people who would capture the benefits. So it's easy to see shark diving being supported by policy. It's a bit more difficult to see um, sanctuaries being put in place where there's not diving. Although there are a number of fishing sanctuaries around the world now that ban fishing of all sorts. So it's not impossible, but it's a bit more difficult. Okay, I'll stop there. And we've got a few minutes for some more questions. So please feel free to unmute and ask your question, or you can put it in the chat. Okay, maybe I've answered all the questions. We did have some very interesting questions earlier on, um, and I think we sort of those questions got to the main issues. Let's just go up and see if there are any questions that I didn't answer. And we talked about that one. We talked about that. Yeah, we talked about that one. Yes, I think we did answer all the questions. Okay, well, look, if there are no questions, we can finish there. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope that you learned something useful from the presentation. I think this is a topic that is very interesting itself, but it also has interesting messages that are relevant for other types of tourism as well, and for other types and for conservation of other types of animals. So I hope that you will think about the messages from this presentation and how they might affect other situations that you might find yourself working in or advising in future after this course. So,
Okay, Prof. Panel. Okay, class, we have already heard the fruitful knowledge about shark tourism and it is economic value. Very interesting, Prof. And we come to the end of this session, but before I end this session, I would like to give a photo art of you. I hope it is you, Prof. Panel. Uh, if it is not you, I will check later. Okay. I will send to your email as well later.
okay.
Okay. Is it you?
Yes,
Or
it is.
oh yeah.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
It's just a little appreciation from us because you can share about the shark tourism to our participant, Prof. And to all participants, also do not forget to fulfill your attendance form that I will put on the meeting chat. And again, to Prof. Panel, on behalf of the Resource and Environmental Economics Department and the ESL Summer Course Committee. Also, Melanie Buitenzorgi say hello to you, Prof. I would like to say thank you so much for such a wonderful session this morning on the ESL Summer Course Program held by the Department of Resource and Environmental Economics. Faculty of Economics and Management, IPB University. Again, thank you for all participants and see you again in the next session. Thank you, Prof. Panel.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Nice to meet you.
You too.
Oke, Mas Arif. Sebentar untuk peserta, saya akan, I will copy the link, ya, of the attendance form. Wait a minute. Okay, you now can fulfill the presents link. Okay, thank you everybody. See you again. Bye-bye. Do not forget to fulfill the attendance form, right?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Wasif, bye-bye.
Sorry, where's the absence link?
And the meeting chat, I've already put there. Can you see?
No, we didn't receive it. No link.
Not yet.
Oh,
No,
sorry,
it's
sorry,
not uploaded.
sorry. Sorry,
It's not
sorry.
uploaded.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not
yeah.
see anything.
I do a mistake. I sent to one of you. I forgot to Muhammad Hakil. So sorry. So sorry. Sorry, Muhammad Akil.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
okay, now we see.
Yeah. Okay. Muhammad Basir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.